Okay, welcome everybody to this session. Just to explain for those who are who might be watching the recording later on. So this is a training session that is being delivered by me, Charlie Dorr, researcher in residence on the Plymouth Health Determinants Research Collaboration. And the session is on doing scoping reviews. It's part 2. It's the second part of the session. The first part is available on the Plymouth HDRC YouTube channel. So I do suggest watching the first part before watching this part. This session is being delivered live to some colleagues within Plymouth City Council and partner organisations, and those colleagues are all staff members or community researchers who are being supported and undertaking research with the Plymouth HDRC. And the example we're using, as in the first scoping review training session, is around the retrofitting project, which I'm doing with some colleagues in the Net Zero team at Plymouth City Council. So just to outline some learning outcomes. So we're hoping that at the end of this session, you'll develop an understanding of each of the key steps of the scoping review process, specifically focusing on those we didn't cover in the first session. And we also want to help you understand some of the basics of doing full text screening and data extraction using NVivo, which is a particular package, and also to specifically understand how to do full text screening, data extraction, analysis, and reporting. And finally, just to give some ideas of where you can go for further information. So what resources you can access. So these are the elements we're going to be covering. So from full text screening right the way through to reporting. It's probably best summed up with this chart here. So those of you who have seen or attended the first session will probably recognize this. So this is an overview of the steps in a scoping review. So all the way from doing some preliminary searches to see what research, what scoping reviews or other literature reviews might have been undertaken on a particular subject, and developing a question that you can use for your scoping review right the way through to reporting on the results. So last time we covered these 8 elements from that preliminary search all the way through to title and abstract screening. And in this session, we're just focusing on the last 4. So full text screening, data extraction, analysis and synthesis, and then reporting. I should point out, just like I did last time, that while this chart is quite a useful way of conceptualizing how a scoping review takes place, in real life it's not really as linear as this. This is particularly, or at least just as much the case with the last few stages of the scoping review as it is with earlier stages. So actually what we'll find when we look at full text screening, data extraction and then analysis is that they all sort of start to sort of overlap with each other a bit, and that you may find you may need to go back to and revisit certain things that you decided on at an earlier time. And one of the advantages with a scoping review is that because it's more explorative, there is a bit more flexibility than there is with other review methodologies. So just to start on the sort of screening process. So there are 2 levels of screening. So the first is the title and abstract screening, which is where you've collected all your all the documents, all the papers, reports, book chapters as part of your search, and you're going through the titles and the abstracts and checking which of them should be included in a full review. So that's what we covered in the first session. And then there's the full text review. So it's looking at the full text of each of those each of those papers that you've included in the first level in the title and abstract screening. Now, this is where one of the areas where there are differences between the types of reviews. So some of you may be familiar with systematic reviews, which are the sort of gold standard type review for critical questions like whether a specific drug or a specific vaccine is efficacious. So they're used for all sorts to answer all sorts of important questions, and they follow a very fixed process. They tend to involve an independent double-blind double screening, so you'd have two researchers per article, unaware of the other's rating, with a third reviewer to deal with conflicts. I should also mention with systematic reviews there is an additional stage as well after the screening process and the full text review, which is the quality assessment, but that's not something we need to worry about with scoping reviews. So scoping reviews are more varied, so not necessarily blind. You could involve two researchers, two reviewers per paper, or possibly just for a sample. So you might potentially just have one reviewer per paper, but they take a sample of the papers and review those together to get an idea of whether there's any sort of systematic differences between the two reviewers in terms of what papers they would include and what papers they would exclude. Because if you do find there's a systematic difference, that could be a problem. And as with the title and abstract screening, with full text screening, you are looking to review against the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So that's the critical thing. So if we take the example from the retrofitting scoping review, here's the inclusion criteria, which is organized on a PCC framework, so participants, concept, and context. So we were looking to include studies which looked at how retrofitting interventions could be prioritized to improve cost efficiency, create better health outcomes, reduce health inequalities, and also look at cost effectiveness. And we had certain participants we were interested in, so studies that are focused on people with low household incomes, and those with serious physical or mental health conditions, because these are the people who are targeted by local authority retrofitting schemes, and they're the ones whose health can most benefit from the provision of publicly funded retrofitting. We had a concept, which was, in our case, was home retrofitting, which was defined as the addition of any improvement to a property for the purpose of producing clean energy or improving the property's energy efficiency. And as well as that, a home retrofitting scheme, which was defined as a scheme specifically set up to deliver home retrofitting to eligible households. And context is also important for inclusion criteria as well. So in the search criteria, you might specify, for example, when you might specify that you only want studies after a particular date or studies from particular countries. But as I think both myself and some other people on the call can testify, it doesn't necessarily mean they won't be present in the papers that you end up having to review, because even though search databases can be quite powerful in terms of enabling filtering, quite often studies which don't meet your filtering criteria will be included, and you'll have to sift them out yourself. And that's assuming, of course, that you are able to filter them in the first place. Okay. So I am just going to move on a little bit to full text screening and data extraction. So full text screening, as it suggests, you're reviewing the full text of the paper. So the key thing is you've got all papers, you've got all the abstracts that you've included in the first level screening. Then you need to go and actually find the papers or other outputs if they may not be journal articles, there may be reports, there may be book chapters. So you need to find them, and then you need to review each of them. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to read the whole text. It's just enough to make a decision on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. So looking at the aims and objectives, looking at who was included in the research is quite important for that, because you may find that the participants who are included in that research, despite what you read in the abstract, don't meet your inclusion criteria. You may find the context isn't quite the same. This is especially the case if the abstract doesn't provide very much information, because you may find in that first level that you include quite a few abstracts with only a small amount of information, and you included them just because that was all you could base your decision on. You need to also state which of the conclusion criteria, if any, are met. It will be critical for the papers to meet the inclusion criteria in some way, but also provide reasons for any exclusions. And that's so you're providing, whereas in the text and abstract stage, you don't necessarily need to provide as much information. In the full text screening, it's much more important to provide those details. I'm just going to halt the screen, just check in case there's any questions or anything in the chat. No, there isn't, so I'm going to go back to the slides. So the next stage after full text screening is data extraction. I'll go into the reason why you'll become clearer soon why it is that I'm going through each stage quite quickly. So in data extraction, you are reading each of the papers, but these are the papers that are included at the full text screening stage. So they've met your inclusion criteria. You know they need to be part of your review, so you do have to read each of those papers. And the purpose of data extraction is to summarize or extract the key points from each paper required by your data extraction form, which I'll come to in a moment. It's important as well with data extraction to provide details of where the data is extracted from, so the paper and preferably the page number. And the process should provide you with a data set which can be used for your analysis as well. So which will be the next step. So in terms of the data extraction form, key thing to do is to consider what data you need for your analysis. So a data extraction form can include the main details for each paper. So some of the data you need in a data extraction form is pretty generic. So it's things like year of publication, location of the study, study designs, whether it's a qualitative study, for example, involving focus groups or semi-structured interviews, or a quantitative study involving a randomized controlled trial or the analysis of statistics. Assuming the study is primary research, so research with collecting data from people, then you need to extract data on the study population and also about the methods that were used. And then the other key area, of course, is the study findings. So what is it that study's telling you, and which findings are relevant to your research questions. So for quantitative studies, so studies involving the study of quantitative data, so statistics, survey findings, the results of trials, you're looking at recording the metrics against key outcomes. So that could be a change in hospital admissions for respiratory conditions following a retrofit intervention. So if a study was analysing the impact of retrofitting on hospital admissions, you would want to actually specify what that outcome criteria is, and then specify the results that the study actually finds. And then for qualitative studies, or for mixed method studies, it's a bit more looser than that in a sense. So you're looking instead at key themes. So an example could be in general, participants felt councils needed to do more to promote retrofitting interventions to residents. So this could be the type of thing you might find in a qualitative study involving focus groups or sort of unstructured interviews with residents and other people. One thing I would suggest doing to develop a data extraction form is looking at key templates that are available. So the link here goes to the Joanna Briggs Institute Mixed Methods Data Extraction Form. And there are other resources available with the JBI. This extraction form was developed for systematic reviews, but has been used for scoping reviews as well. An important thing as well is that a data extraction form is not set in stone. So in a scoping review, so it could potentially be revised if new issues or items come up. And this is goes back to the point I made about linearity. So you may have your data extraction form, but then as you're reading and doing the full text, the reading of full text articles, you actually come up with new points and new ideas that you think, oh, we actually should be including them in our data extraction, that they would enhance the study and help answer the question. That's not necessarily the same as systematic review, because in a systematic review, it's very much about doing it's very much an approach to we need the answer to this specific question, and this is the specific data we need. It's much more restrictive and much more well, structured in terms of what you're trying to find out. But in a scoping review, it's more explorative, so that does give you a little bit more leeway. Another key thing about both full text reviewing and data extraction is choosing a platform. So now for sort of smaller basic literature reviews, which could include scoping reviews, you may just be able to do it on Excel. You know, you could use an Excel spreadsheet with a table listing the papers in the column on the left, and then having various columns for your extracted data, or for the reasons for including and excluding papers. But there are also some more specialist platforms that could be used, and they'd be particularly helpful if you're doing a larger scoping review. So NVivo, which I'll be talking about shortly, is a qualitative analysis software. So my first experience of NVivo actually came from using it for interviews and focus group analysis. But it can also be used for full text screening and data extraction in literature reviews as well. So that's a potentially useful tool to use. It does require a license, and those of you who are with the HDRC, though, do speak to us about it, because the HDRC does actually have some computers with an NVivo license to use if you do require them. There's other platforms as well. So Rayan is another one I've used quite a bit of. Rayan's often used for the earlier stages of a review, including the text and abstract screening, but it does have an data extraction capability. Personally, I found it a little difficult because it doesn't have some of the functionality, or doesn't appear to have some of the functionality I would like, including things like the use of drop-down response options, and some of the saving and highlighting options aren't how I would prefer. But it's another thing you could look into. And there are also a few other platforms available, like JBI, Summary, and Covidence, which I don't really have much personal experience of. So, and I'm just going to check if there's any. Just go check if there's any other questions. Right, so that's good. So, so in terms of how you do full screening and data extraction, it's important to have a reviewing team. So this isn't really something you do on your own. If you're doing a literature review, as part of a course you're doing, say a master's degree, or for a dissertation, you may be the only person doing the literature review, and it may also be the case if you're doing a more informal literature review for another piece of research work. But for a scoping review, really should be a team approach. It's important to have on your a reviewing team which includes some of the knowledge users as well. So in the case of the retrofitting work, that's the case where I'm working with some people here who will actually be using the knowledge of the results. Piloting is also pretty critical. So as with the text and abstract screening, where we did some piloting, it's important to try and pilot both the screening criteria and the data extraction form to see if it's fit for purpose. And then also linked to that is the need to do some sort of calibration exercise. So if, as with a lot of reviews, each paper is going to be reviewed just by one person, then it's important to do calibrate, do a calibration exercise whereby you both work on a sample and see which of those papers you would include and which you would exclude. You'd work on that sample separately and then come together to check your results against each other. And hopefully there'll be general agreement on what to include and exclude. And if there is disagreement, you'll be able to understand why it is. It could be useful as well to work with a third party, so a third person. And they can then also give their sort of final say on what papers they think should be included. And then once you've done that calibration exercise, you'll then have more confidence to then to each go out and review a sample of the papers independently and individually from each other. It's also critical to have regular check-ins as well. So if you do your calibration exercise, you've got a good idea now about what papers you think should be included and what papers you think shouldn't be, because you've looked at that sample. But you still might come across unexpected questions, so that you still might come across unusual papers where you're thinking, well, I'm not sure whether I would include or exclude, or I think I would probably include, but I'm not sure if other members of the team would agree. And that's why having regular check-ins is useful. So in fact, someone did check in with me about another scoping review I'm working at only a few days ago about a paper. So using your team is really your other teammates is a really important part of the screening process. Okay, and then once you've sort of done once you've done the sort of full text screening and data extraction, the next stage is around data analysis. And this is a tricky one to sort of describe in a training session, because there's no real single approach to data analysis. In a scoping review, various different methodologies have been suggested, and it will depend on the question and the type of studies you're reviewing, and also to some extent on the topic as well. Some scoping reviews are going to be more quantitative, some will be more qualitative, and that's going to have a big impact on what sort of data analysis you use. However, there is some guidance and some suggestions about how you could start to do data analysis. So the JBI, the Joanna Briggs Institute that I mentioned earlier, stressed that analysis should be primarily descriptive. One of the things they emphasize is that these aren't systematic reviews. So scoping reviews aren't going to definitively answer questions to lead to policy changes. They're more explorative, and they give more of an overview of a subject area or a particular topic area. So they recommend a more descriptive form of analysis. So in terms of looking at quantitative data, that means using frequency counts and tabular and graphical presentation. It doesn't so much mean using advanced statistical techniques, which is something which you would be doing in a systematic review, which of course also requires training in those techniques. And similarly, when it comes to qualitative analysis, they suggest sort of basic qualitative content analysis rather than going into too much depth. Thematic analysis is pretty common. So this is, to sort of describe it generally, it's where a researcher extracts information from each paper around key themes, and often these are illustrated by quotes or specific extracts from the sources. So you may say, for example, several papers emphasize the need for citizen engagement with designing a retrofitting policy, and you include quotes or extracts from a couple of those papers to just illustrate what they were saying, what those papers were saying. And this is also where quantitative and qualitative can kind of combine a little bit, because while it's thematic analysis, you may also include the numbers of papers that actually mention that particular themes, the numbers of papers that mention the need for citizen engagement, as well as including a bit more depth with some of those quotes. These are just some examples from some quantitative studies, just of how you might represent quantitative data. So one of them from Pollock et al. 2023 was looking at the geographical spread of information on a particular topic, and they represented that using a map of the world. Treacle et al. 2024's one's a bit different, because this is actually showing showing how the scoping review itself was carried out numerically. So it talks about, first of all, the number of records identified from databases. It might be a little bit difficult to see, but over 11,000 records were initially identified through their search, although nearly 3,000 of those were duplicates. Then they did the title and abstract screening, which we talked about in the first session, and excluded over 8,000 of the records as a consequence of that. Then they retrieved the remaining records and then assessed them for eligibility. So that would be in sort of full text screening. And some of the records, of course, they weren't able to screen, and so they've got some records that were not retrieved. And then a final number were included in the report, in the review, and included in the report, and that number's 24 at the bottom there. So when it comes to data extraction and analysis, one of the things you'll start to develop is a coding framework. So just to explain for those that might not know, so coding is a process of categorizing the data from the different papers. So it's a coding framework should list all the categories and explain the relationship between them. And there are two main approaches to this. One is a deductive approach. So this is where your codes, the things you're interested in, are based on your research questions, on research theory, on past research that was undertaken and developed before the analysis took place, and it guides where you put the extracted data. So we're doing a scoping review around retrofitting. There'll be certain codes we know are likely to come up in the study based on what we know already. So things like how we know retrofitting is prioritized already, the use of area-based data on deprivation, for example, things like that. We might include as part of an initial coding framework, and then we see when we came to actually looking at the papers whether we ended up extracting data that related to those existing codes. And then the other approach is kind of the other way around. So it's the inductive approach. So this is where your coding framework is developed as you do the data extraction analysis and you find what's relevant. So it still needs to answer the research questions. It's still got to be codes that will actually help you in that. But you come up with the codes as you read the papers, and some of the codes may be suggested by what you're reading. In reality, it's likely that your coding framework is going to involve a bit of both. And remembering that in a scoping review, it's not a completely linear process. So you will find a mixture of deductive and inductive coding. You will have some codes already, or at least some ideas, at least in your head, as to what codes are going to come up. And then new codes will probably come up as you're doing your data extraction. The coding framework also shows the overlaps between data extraction and analysis, because coding is actually a part of analysis. You're already starting to identify the key themes that are going to eventually be in your report. So your initial codes might just be general things that each paper mentions. So things like, for example, the importance of using health criteria when or criteria around specific health conditions like respiratory conditions when targeting retrofitting interventions. But you may later find that you develop more conceptual codes as a consequence. But the point is that your analysis is kind of almost starting a bit with the data extraction, because the two processes overlap somewhat. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about an example from NVivo. I'm just going to check if there's any questions before we continue. So I do think there is a question. So I'm just going to read it. So yes, so being asked whether the inductive approach requires more reflexivity, because as a researcher, we are choosing what is important and should be analysed rather than what the field of literature is guiding us to look at. And I guess it seems as it is more open to subjectivity and risks information being missed. I mean, that is a really good question, and also a potential and a criticism that people can make of inductive research approaches. I suppose I would say, in defense of inductive research, that you're not doing it in the complete absence of a framework, because you still have your research questions. So you still have your you still already mark the parameters of what the research is interested in, both in your research questions and in your inclusion criteria. And so the codes that you generate inductively aren't done so in a vacuum and aren't just arbitrarily chosen by you. You're still seeing their relevance to your work. But I think you're right as well that it could potentially be seen in that way, and this is one of the reasons why I think in reality a mixture of inductive and deductive is probably necessary. Okay, hopefully that answers the question. Now I'm just going to go and see if I can. I'm going to just reshare for a moment and just sorry, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go through the examples of an example from NVivo in a moment. I did produce a few slides from doing the data extraction and the full text screening in NVivo, but I will actually open NVivo shortly in a moment just to show you what it looks like. But some of the few key steps, once you've actually set up an NVivo file and saved it, the key thing is to, first of all, is to import your files. So if you've got your papers saved in a folder on your system, you can import the files just by right-clicking and importing them into NVivo, and then each of them will then appear as a list. And you'll see in a minute the process for full text screening and data extraction in NVivo is a bit different. So for full text screening, you need to set up a case classification. So on the left, you go down to where it says case classifications. It may not be visible at first, so you need to click the drop down next to cases, and you right click on case classifications and then put your name in for what you want it to be called. And then once you set up a case classification, you can then add your key inclusion criteria. So you can do that by clicking on new attribute and then adding each of your inclusion criteria in. So you can add a column for whether the population meets your inclusion criteria, or whether the concept meets your inclusion criteria, or you could split it any way you want, but you could do it through adding those attributes in. And you'd also provide you'd also include some of the more general information. So so here you see we've got the first few attributes in. I've put one paper in, and I've got year, population, the concept. It's not been reviewed yet. And then you can complete the full text screening using the attributes created. So once your file is in NVivo, you'll be able to view the whole file in NVivo, and then you'll be able to use the table that you've created in your case classification section to say whether the paper meets your different inclusion criteria. And one of the good things about NVivo is that any answers you enter creates a series of drop-down options, which then makes it easier for you to do the analysis. And this is just a version of a partially complete full text screening. So this is one for a study we're doing for the HDRC on smoking cessation and vaping, where we've got, well, I had 22 papers to do full text screening of. So each of these papers I've looked at in NVivo, not necessarily read the whole paper because it wasn't always necessary to do that if I'm end up excluding them. So some of them being excluded, some of them have been included, some not assigned. Where they've been excluded, I've said what the reasons are. So so some of these are review articles, that's where they're excluded. You may find that is a point to make as well. You will find there will be review articles in your scoping review, so you will identify review articles. And the key thing with a review article that you identify as part of your scoping review is not so much the findings of that review article, although they may be useful and important, but it's also whether there's any relevant papers in that review article that they've noticed but you haven't. So in this particular instance, as an example, so we were looking at sort of light touch forms of smoking cessation, and there were a couple of scoping reviews. So I had a look through each of those scoping reviews just to check if there were any eligible studies that would pass our inclusion criteria, which we hadn't included, and I think there weren't any in this particular case. So that's just an example. So I'm just going to stop sharing this for the moment and just see if I can share an NVivo file. So I'm just going to do that. It's better to share a file rather than a rather than the screen. So this was the file that I was just using to start to demonstrate how NVivo works. Here is where you get your list of papers. So I've only put one in, which is a decision support framework for residential heating. If you click on it, it should, fingers crossed, give you the full paper. If you click on case classifications down here and go to full text screening, and then click here, sorry, I'm gonna have to just, these things are a little bit bigger actually. So you can see the started doing a table for the full text screening, so saying what the population is and what the concept is, and you can fill in and just right click information there about whether it's eligible or whether it's the eligible population or not the eligible population. And then when you get round to the second stage, so after you've done the sort of full text screening and decided what files to include, what papers to include, the next stage is of course data extraction. That can also be done in NVivo, but it's done for a slightly different process. So if we assumed for a moment that this, I'll just close that for a moment, and this as well. So if we assume for a moment that this paper is included, you can actually use NVivo to start developing your code. So so you can, and there are two ways in which you could add codes. One is you could actually add the codes in before you actually look at the paper. So you could call that a deductive approach. So add certain things like, say, key findings, and then under the findings you might so that would be a code, and then under that you might include a subcode. So I'm gonna leave that actually, and I'm gonna leave that as it is and try and do an inductive one, which I'm sorry, feels a bit like cheating, but I am. So, and when you find a code that you want to include, you can highlight and move that code and then actually move that code there. So this is something about a carbon tax. So if you did want a carbon tax, and this is very crude because I'm not sure you would want that for this, but we could create a code for that. Just right-clicking and then creating that code, and because you've created it under key findings, it would appear as a subcode, and then you could take all this text here, and then you could right-click and code the selection to a code here. So like that. And then one of the advantages with NVivo is the code will, the text will then appear under the code if you click on it, next to, and it will also tell you what paper it came from. And you can even use it to check the number of papers that have mentioned a particular concept. So because if you find you have other papers that mention a carbon tax, you'll whenever you put them in, the number of files, number of references will increase, and you then can use that to do a basic quantitative analysis for your scoping review, as well, of course, of being able to use the actual data here as part of your analysis. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that now. Just go back to the spreadsheet. So I just had another question, another couple of questions. One is, why would a paper be unassigned? That is actually just because it hasn't been reviewed yet, not because it's not because it will be unassigned. And so I'm just going to go back and try and share. So the next few slides really, we're just looking at NVivo a bit more. So we've kind of covered them. So they basically just outline how you can create new codes. So we've kind of covered that by just going directly to NVivo. Yeah, just the point about inductive and deductive codes. So what you might find is that some of your parent codes are deductive because they come from your data extraction form, but then you may find some inductive codes that come from the actual papers themselves. So that's one way in which they might also combine initially. And this is an example of a coding framework that I've been working on, which is not fully completed, but you'll notice the little initials, and that's actually because I'm not the only person on the scoping review, and if I'm creating new codes, then I do need to make the other reviewer aware that I've done so, because they may have created similar codes, but they might be differently named. So in fact, this is quite a useful example of where there will be both some inductive and deductive codings, because the codes that don't have initials will have been part of our initial coding framework, and some of the ones which do have initials will have arisen as part of the data extraction. So just want to sort of bring it sort of back now, so and just say a little bit about reporting. So so when you get round to doing a report on a review, you need to bring the focus of your work back to the research questions. So so that's going to be the key thing that you're going to be needing to report on. So it's always best to remember that. Full reporting should provide details of each of the stages of the review, so including the results from the search. And you saw earlier in one of the examples where I showed you some examples of quantitative data presentation for scoping reviews. that it's useful to have a flow chart to provide detail on each of the stages of the review in terms of how many papers were identified by the search, how many were duplicates, how many were excluded during text and abstract screening, and how many were excluded during full text screening. Details on the sources of the data are also important, including countries of origin, year of publication. So those things are going to be useful for your review. You also need to think about the purpose and potential utility of the review, and be sort of clear how the review might differ from other reviews, like a systematic review as well. So specifying the limitations of any review is also important. People need to understand that the scoping review is going to be explorative. It's not going to provide a very specific fixed answer to a research question, but it can help inform either further research or further policy development. But it's unlikely to be the only thing you're going to be using as evidence in order to create policy change. And also, in light of that as well, it's also useful to consider other activities which may need to be done. So stakeholder consultation is an important aspect and quite often used alongside scoping reviews. Again, some scoping reviews also are later followed by systematic reviews. It will depend very much on your topic area and policy area for that. And there's just a few other things I wanted to mention, because we've been going on for just over an hour, so we're almost through. So just a few final points. Firstly, it's to make sure you check out the preliminary work first. So before doing any scoping review, it's good to see whether anyone else has done anything like this before. So any other reviews, whether they're scoping reviews, systematic reviews, narrative reviews on a particular topic, it's really useful to know that. And if you go back to the first training session video, there are some suggestions for how you can try and find out if any previous work has been done. Having a team is essential. So scoping review is not something that's just done by one individual, and keeping in contact with the team and exchanging experiences and dealing with problems together is very important. So particular problems that come up with certain papers. I suppose I could say another thing is around expecting the unexpected, that there are going to be difficulties along the way. There are going to be issues with your inclusion criteria. Maybe there'll be things that you didn't quite think of when you designed them. Maybe there might be differences of interpretation between each of you as reviewers. So the more you keep that team communication, that regular meetings or using emails, the more likely you're not going to have any problems, or not that you're not going to have any problems, you're more likely to be able to address those problems sooner rather than later. And just also being realistic about how long it's going to take. So scoping reviews can involve a substantial amount of work, and this is probably an area where I could do with a little bit a bit more application of learning. You don't usually know when you do a scoping review how many articles you are going to find that are going to be included. So really considering when you come up with your inclusion criteria, how you're going to find the time to review all the papers is going to be really important. A scoping review is not a quick bit of literature review. And just referring back to your questions and inclusion criteria, because you may come up with some very interesting articles. Some articles that come up with some very interesting findings that may actually have some relevance, but aren't actually answering your questions, that are more relevant to other topic areas or related interests that you have. And it's important not to be too distracted by that and to keep your focus on your questions where you can. And remember as well that there is flexibility in scoping reviews because they are explorative and things are really rarely linear as well. So a lot of the stages that I talked about do sort of overlap, and I hope that's kind of clear from this second session. Just include some useful resources as well. So the JBI Scoping Review Network is definitely worth visiting because they've got loads of information about scoping reviews. The Evidence Synthesis Island have also produced a useful resource on getting started with scoping reviews, and the Prisma extension for scoping reviews is also worth visiting because they provide a template for reporting scoping reviews. So that was based on an earlier template they did for reporting systematic reviews. So it's really useful if you're wondering how to structure a full report on scoping reviews. And finally, there's just a few references as well. So brilliant. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to check if there are some more questions, but I'm going to stop the recording now if that's okay. And just to say as well, so this is just a reminder, this is a Plymouth Health Determinants Research Collaboration training session, and you can find more information on our YouTube channel, other training sessions as well on other issues like other research methods like ripple effects mapping, appreciative inquiry, and also more information on our website. Thank you.